As somebody who has been actively campaigning for the delivery of the education rights and entitlements of black children since 1965, I came here in 64. I worked with some other people, local people in Oxford, East Oxford, and started the first black supplementary school in Cowley, in East Oxford in 1966. And from then till now, I've been active in campaigns to secure equal rights and justice for black people, and to call out the racism of the state at systemic levels, at institutional levels, cultural levels. And it is as if all of that we've done, I mean, you've mentioned New Beacon. This bookshop and publishing house started in 1966. And we were concerned that we needed to do something about decolonizing the curriculum and ensuring that teachers and lecturers, etc., had the material that they could use, not only to make our children feel better about themselves and teach them stuff that they could identify with, but to correct that white supremacist notion that Britain had encouraged in its own population, who didn't know themselves either. Because it wasn't teaching them about working class history. It wasn't teaching them about the dark satanic mills and the pits and children up chimneys and child labor and so on and so forth. All of that was sanitized. So what we have now with this Windrush business is a sanitizing of the black experience in Britain since 1948. It's erasure. And those in government who are wanting to fund all of this business are very clear as to what they would fund and what they wouldn't fund. So if we went to them and said, listen, it's about time that we did something to enable people who were caught in the Windrush dragnet to have legal advice wherever and whenever they wanted, and not just lawyers acting pro bono, to be paid. And if we want to do something about the huge number of people who are killed by the police, and they have inquests, and the inquests talk about death by misadventure or excessive use of police force and so on and so forth, those families shouldn't need to have to scrimp and scrunt and save in order to buy justice. If we were to say, okay, you are so concerned about the contribution that the Caribbean people have made, put your money in your pocket and fund all of these things so that they could fight those injustices, they would tell you to go to hell. I came to know about New Beacon Books, I think, early in 1966, because of what I was actually doing in Oxford. So I was studying theology. I was really interested in liberation theology, particularly given what was happening in the United States of America and in the Caribbean also. And I was very conscious of the need to be able to draw upon resources, black people telling our own history, literature that connected us with our experiences and the geography of our lives and our diaspora and so on and so forth. And I became very, very conscious fairly early on that we were assaulted daily and throughout our whole academic existence by Western epistemologies, ways of producing and disseminating knowledge, ways of validating knowledge even. And that troubled me. I mean, for God's sake, I became very, very aware early on, which is why I'm no longer in that field, that if anything needed decolonizing, it was the Bible. And with it, Christianity and everything that fanned out from that. So it seemed to me that we needed to have ways of making sense of our world and of the world. How do we make sense of our presence in Britain as people with developed consciousness, global consciousness? I mean, I'm from a tiny village in Grenada. I suppose the population of the village would be less than 200, right? But I had a global consciousness. Why? Because my father, although he was totally illiterate, walked around with a transistor radio every day, and he was always listening to the World Service or some BBC program or some shortwave program or something or other. So I learned a lot from him. And I was conscious that we were not the center of the universe in Grenada, nor was Britain. So it really meant that I needed to have a consciousness of myself in relation to people in a similar position as myself, colonized people. What was happening in Sri Lanka? What was happening in India? How come there were all of these Indians in Trinidad and in Grenada and in Guyana and so on and so forth? By what process did these populations get extracted from where they were indigenously and brought to the Caribbean? So it helped me to understand indentureship, indentured laborers coming in to do what the liberated Africans were doing. It helped me to understand the relationship between colonialism as in the pearl of the empire, India, and the Caribbean and so on. And particularly that we are a people who are as creative as any other people on earth. There were ancient civilizations in Africa and functioning democratic societies long before there were in Athens and Greece and those places. So it was important that we knew that. It was important that we had referents that enabled us to be comfortable and proud in our own skin, because everything else around us was trying to tell us that we were brainless and rubbish and so on. So this bookshop, this project that John LaRose initiated with his tremendous vision in the early 1960s was really part of that whole tradition. And let's remember, he called it New Beacon because of the Beacon newspaper in Trinidad, which was a revolutionary anti-colonial organ for the expression of thought and criticism and different constructions of the world under colonialism in that region. And again, I talk about a continuity. So one of the reasons why, as the notice on the board out there tells us, more than just a bookshop. New Beacon has always been more than just a place selling books and even publishing books. It was not a commercial venture that was about what can we publish and what would bring us the most money, etc. It really was concerned with providing people with tools for analysis and tools for action, centering us in relation to our own creative potential our own capacity to disseminate our cultural products and have discourses around them, and making sure that they were not considered to be any less valid in terms of the validation of knowledge than any other. And which is what the Caribbean artist movement was about. It really was about celebrating who we were and demonstrating to the world that we're not just jockeying to be as good as them. We've always been better than the backwardness that effectively was used to marginalize and exclude us. So it was a political project in that sense, and still is, because New Beacon provided the tools for us to wage our struggles. We depended upon New Beacon for examples of what others were doing elsewhere, for examples of what we had done that had been successful, or what we had done in which we were defeated. And so it helped to organize and give some direction to our struggles, as well as informing our praxis in that sense. Now, in 1982, when John and the organizing committee staged the first International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, opened at Islington Town Hall by C.L.R. James, that was a historical event. Because what it did was, it brought together black publishers from around the place. It brought together publishers who wanted to make sure that black literature was available around the place. And it brought together people who, in their own academic work, in their own writing, had sought to convey messages to ourselves, about ourselves, as well as about and to the rest of the world. And I mean, those annual book fair events were indescribable in terms of what they did for our consciousness, what they did for our confidence as a people, what they did to ensure that there was some connectedness between our struggles and what other people were doing on other terrains in the Caribbean, in parts of Africa, in Europe, the black diaspora in the United States, on the European continent, and so on. And so it is some 9 years after we started the book fair that we determined that it was essential to have the George Padmore Institute named after one of the main voices and activists in Pan-Africanism and in the organizing of the 1945 Pan-African Congress. The idea was that it would be a resource, a library and a research center and an archive that actually spoke to, curated the work and experiences of cultural and political activists pretty much since the Second World War. And it is a massive resource so that, we could document our work in trying to build a supplementary school movement, in building the Black Parents Movement, the Black Youth Movement around issues to do with schooling and policing and much else besides. And that is quite important. It's quite important that younger people understand where that came from and why, we keep reminding people that New Beacon is not just a bookshop. It's not just an alternative to Amazon. It's rooted and grounded in black struggle in creating and sustaining communities of resistance. I think, first of all, we need to understand and be constantly aware that we're in a different place and a different time. But by that I mean, whatever construction some might want to have about the British state, Britain is a very different place to what it was in 1948. Demographically, it is totally changed. There are now parts of this country where you have the black and global majority as the majority, and it would be a nonsense to continue to think of them as ethnic minorities, right? But then it's also in a different place in relation to how people organize their lives. Work is different. When these folk came on this boat in 1948, there weren't computers around. The way we communicated with one another was very, very different. When people came, they settled in areas where others like themselves had been, which is why you have a preponderance of Jamaican people in Lambeth and Brent and so on and so forth, a preponderance of people from Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, etc., in West London, Ealing, Acton, Shepherd's Bush, Notting Hill, a preponderance of people from the twin island of Carriacou with Grenada in Huddersfield and so on. But what is interesting about that is that all of those communities I've just mentioned did something very sensible on arrival. They set up groups, Caribbean-based groups. So you had the Grenada Nationals Association, the Jamaica Nationals Association, the Trinidad and Tobago Society, and so on. And people came, and they were members of those organizations. They were concerned both with what was happening to them as they tried to settle here, and what was continuing to happen in the lands from which they came. And that connectedness was not just a sort of visceral, nostalgic thing. It was practical. It was functional. Because it is the remittances from those communities that kept most of those islands alive. Much more than their tourism and their agriculture and their bananas exports and so on and so forth. So there was an economic relationship, economic continuity. People talk about coming here to help build Britain. They really came here to help build the places from which they had come. Because they didn't only simply send back the money that they had borrowed in order to pay a fare to come here. Their relatives depended upon their remittances. And some of them were sending money home, in some cases disastrously, to build homes to which they expected to return. Because most of them had thought they would be here only for about 5 years or so. All right? So there was that. So in that sense, there was a functional continuity between their presence here, from whichever island they came, and the countries from which they had come. What is interesting about that is as the years rolled on, those organizations became less important. The children of those early migrants were not identifying as Grenadians or Trinidadians or whatever. They were identifying as Black British. And there was a whole new culture emerging amongst them, whether based on art, creativity, music, theater, spoken word, whatever else it may be, or on the kinds of ways in which they related to the labor market and so forth. So that now those countries are not getting the kind of level of remittances that they got in the first 3 or 4 decades after people left to come here. So my point is this: we have to understand these are fundamental changes, right? And you can't establish a continuity between Windrush and those young people. It doesn't make sense. The question then is, how do we anchor those young people in their own sense of identity as people who are British and African, or Asian and African, Asian and British, and enable them to understand that the contradictions and oppressions and injustices that we faced are continuing to be heaped upon them, and they need different methods of coping with all of that in terms of how they organize themselves collectively across racial divides, across gender divides, across class divides, so that they are very clear about the vision of the society that they want to build for the future.